All right, hello and welcome to Between the Liars with Ryan and Josh
Hello there.
and Marcelo.
Hello, everyone.
And today we're going to be discussing space policy and a bunch of other things surrounding it.
Talking about space.
It's going to be a little bit different. Usually we bring you current news and events. Today we bring you things that are still relevant and still based in politics, but a little more whimsical, a little probably less heated than things usually get. A nice little vacation from that. So before we get into all of that, if you're watching the live stream of this, we would greatly appreciate if you would like and subscribe to this channel and hit those notifications so you can join us when we're live. Sorry to cover you there, Marcelo. And also remember, you can follow us on all of our social medias at Between the Liars. And let's just get straight into it. So, Josh, why don't you help us understand a little bit? Because I know that if people have been paying attention to the discussions surrounding space, we've got public sectors, we've got private sectors. What would be the defining features of those, and help us separate those for those who might not be aware?
Well, right now what we're going on is in some ways a second space race, but instead of occurring between competing global superpowers, it's competing between global supercorporations. Strategically different. But it shares a lot of the same thing. A lot of these companies are pushing for the first of something, and they're in a lot of experimental stages with different technologies and different ways to gain economic and strategic advantages from their involvement in space. So in the past, we more saw exploration missions funded by government to either push forth like the space race narrative, in no small part just a form of propaganda and competing against another country, to scientific explorations like we see with the International Space Station, the Hubble telescope, or now more recently with the James Webb telescope. These are critical tools for advancing our understanding of physics and other planets. And at a certain extent, a lot of these tools, to the grade and the capability of them that we have today, they just don't work on Earth. You need to get out of the atmosphere to get a better, clearer image, to get more finely tuned sensors, to get away with more of the interference from Earth. There's a lot of reasons to do experiments and exploration of space that we can learn things that we just cannot learn on Earth. Those things also don't make a lot of money. So private corporations have been fairly limited in what they wanted to do with them. Because if you think about the James Webb telescope, it produces some awesome images that are going to write many people's PhDs. I promise you, the amount of PhDs that have come out of the Hubble telescope is an incredible number. They're fantastic tools, and some of the best we have to progress scientific knowledge. They don't make money. The things we learn in the process, maybe 10, 15 years, 20 years down the line, but that's a big speculation.
So from the public sector, is it pretty much just NASA? Are there other aspects to that, or is that kind of the driving force there?
Typically, a country is just going to have an administration that oversees what they are doing and coordinating all of their space flights. The United States obviously has NASA, the Chinese government has the Chinese Manned Space Agency, and the Russians have the Roscosmos, which curiously enough actually is a privately owned corporation by the Russian Federation. They're very keen about that difference, that it's technically a state corporation and not a state agency. You have to ask them about it. I
was gonna say, that sounds like double speak. It sounds like the same thing.
I mean, this is also the agency that promised to withdraw from the International Space Station just after they got their own space station built. Of course, they do have plans for it, and they're working to it. And actually, in no small way, would be great for them to put up another one, because it's only the International Space Station, and China has its own space station as well. So there's only two actual space stations. Now, in terms of the private sector, what we're seeing now, we see a push for satellite technology, better GPS, better cell phone coverage, better cellular internet, things like Starlink, all types of low orbit missions that provide all types of different technologies that we make use of. Bit more down the line, 20, 30 years, we'll see the more development of space tourism, and people, there's already been, mega millionaires spending however much money they spend, who fly up into the stars. That will become more commonplace, but the real money made out in space might be 40 to 50 years down the line, and that's going to be asteroid mining.
Is that just we're running out of precious metals on Earth, so we're going to asteroids, or what does that entail?
It turns out digging's really hard.
Yeah.
Little known fact, we actually can't drill that far into the Earth.
Yeah.
Um,
And when
and
you do,
it's
like, even just for like carbon-based things, the amount of times you have to drill to even strike something, like you've got multiple times you got to drill. So no, that makes sense.
yeah, and it's like, here's this big rock just floating around in space. All we got to do is get out to it, attach a couple, engines to it, and
Mm.
move it back. Whether we, lasso it to a ship of some way or another, tether it down, or just attach thrusters to it, and then get it back to a refining facility, and then get the minerals down back in Earth. It's a much better situation once space flight's a bit more regularly figured out. Because another concern that has been rising alongside of the ever growing amount of private corporations testing and sending up rockets has been you burn a lot of things flying into space, and so you put out a ton of carbon dioxide and other less than great chemicals into our atmosphere every time we fire up a rocket, because we're still using chemical engines.
Yeah. Marcelo is our resident greenhouse gas protester. What are your thoughts on just the grain impact, even if you want to get specific on that?
Honestly, I'm a lot more open to it when it comes to like research, and when the government uses it for NASA. I've never really understood, and maybe we'll talk about this later. I never really understood the idea behind saying, okay, well, the private company can do it because they're better, and then just giving them giving them the money that the government would have used anyways. To me, that's just like, like, it's a lot of innovation, sure, whatever, but like, I don't really, and obviously that applies to other areas like Tesla and other big corporations, that they're like, oh, we're pioneers in this, and then they're obviously being babysat by the government's money and like everything that they're trying to do. That doesn't sound very capitalistic from my perspective.
Yeah, that is true. There has been a lot of critical moments in private space exploration that have taken place that would have gone very differently, save a few NASA engineers, whether that be overview on rocket design and engine design, or just other things they've brought them in. Because credit where credit's due, there is no one better at putting things into space than the United States' NASA. It's just
America, baby, America. That's
yeah.
that's the I love the when I came here to the US to study, I was like, NASA. Like, I wanna be an astronaut. Like, I love it here, and here mainly because it's like, you guys went to space, and that's me. Like, we do these things not because they're easy, but because they're hard. And to me, I think one of the things that used to, and then I don't know if it does anymore. It's this idea that America is still the best at going to space, and they were the first ones to go to, well, not to space but to the moon, and all of those things, that I think that's very like unifying. And NASA got us there, right? Like, Elon Musk didn't get us there.
Yeah, space exploration definitely has, in my opinion, a unique policy place that really can bring people together, because it's something that is so clearly has very little to do with personal gain from doing it. Obviously, there are people who will benefit and have benefited throughout past of being involved with these programs, but nothing you do in space exploration is really for yourself. Every day the ISS stays up and those astronauts live in there, we learn so much more about science and things that will benefit humanity for centuries to come. So it's a very long-term oriented project as well, and helps us keep reminded about the future, and even less so about what we're doing in the here and now, but how do we keep preparing for what is to come, because this is an incredibly long, and complicated process that's taken us.
Do you know offhand which countries are involved in the International Space Station?
I want to say I know the United States and Canada, Russia. I'm not sure how many people come in from Europe. I know there's been a few European
Well, you can even
astronauts up
take
there.
you can even take Russia. I guess what I was wanting to kind of talk about is how you mentioned unifying, and even with the International Space Station, like you've got nations who are either tense with one another or even at odds with one another, who are unified at least when they are in space. There's almost like this bubble of like, this is what we're doing together for the global perspective, as opposed to the individual nation perspective, at least to an extent.
Yeah, I mean, it's also, I think, a very unifying message to have scientists who are working on projects to advance our understanding and our knowledge, who will, who have up, there are Russian scientists up on the ISS with Americans right now, and they have gone about their days, continue to do their research projects for the benefit of humanity. Like the war pretty much hasn't happened for them because they have a job to do up there, and they're focused on doing that. And to some extent, yeah, the conflicts to the planet tend to fade away once you work in the grander scale of, even just our small solar system.
Yeah. Well, let's go back to the which you had mentioned with like the different aspects of going into space. We've talked about mining. We talked about exploration, right? Like the U.S. was the first to put someone on the moon. I believe it was the Russians who were the first to put someone in space.
Yeah.
And so there's different achievements. We've put I feel like a robot degrades what we put on Mars, but you put the Mars rover out there, like
several robots.
We've put a lot out into space for the exploration portion. Let's talk a little bit about like the exploration versus exploitation and like the different ways that we can go about the space stuff. I'll kick it to you, Josh.
Yeah. In my mind, this represents the difference between a lot of the scientific-minded programs that aren't designed to generate a lot of immediate return on investment that could be, 50, 60-year, thought processes and design plans to keep evolving different technology. Like we got the James Webb Telescope up there and it's, active and performing well. They're already working on the next rendition of that, to send up here soon. It's a never nonstop program of building the next better one. And the governments governments of the world have handled a lot of this exploration technique because of that, because you just don't make money on that. Like sending all of those Apollo missions was really cool. We learned a lot of great stuff. No one made money from that. We
Right.
sunk a ton of money into that. No one recouped. Like you could argue some of the technologies developed there have been really beneficial. It's also hard to argue those technologies wouldn't have developed elsewhere. There's not too many space exclusive technologies. Like a lot of people like to point to Wi-Fi. That's great and all. Wi-Fi is a modified radio signal. Like it's just a glorified radio signal in a very specific way. So did we learn it during the space race? Absolutely. Would we have probably figured that out anyways? Yeah. And then there's and there's a lot of cool engineering, like a lot of high reliability and fault resistant technologies. Ways to program a computer to account for solar radiation interfering with the circuitry on board. So a lot of cool innovations come from that, but it does spur a lot of it because a lot of research and development takes place around making these missions possible. And so a lot of innovations can tumble out of that, but it's hard to tie a direct return on investment to these scientific explorations and the technologies that may or may not come, that may or may not see broad acceptance and usage. Now, space exploitation focuses a whole lot more on there's a lot of really expensive and really nice things in space, and it's going to take a lot of money to get out there, a lot of money to set up the stuff to facilitate, refine them, get the materials back to Earth, but it's going to be so worth it. There's a lot of, I would argue there's a lot of environmental benefits to this once we get a better understanding of how to make cleaner rockets, because instead of having to destroy several square miles of a forest to get at this particular ore that's very rare on Earth, there's just a giant rock of it floating around in space, not doing anything, and we can just go have it. Benefits. Nothing's alive in space. You don't have to worry about taking someone's stuff. It's just there, and taking it from there won't upset any natural systems on the planet Earth.
Do you guys think that as we find things that are valuable to us back on Earth, that's then going to lead to territorial conflicts of sorts between the nations, like as we decide like who gets what?
I think it already has, right? There's a reason why the U.S. put their flag up on the moon, right? They were like, like it's everybody's is mine, right? Like it's not. There's a declaration, right, that says that space is for everyone. Like nobody really has a claim to any part of space, but I can't really see that staying that way. The question then is with corporations, who are you gonna find for a corporation just like being like, whoop, this meter is mine. Oh, thank you.
You just have like flags just on different meteors, and then once you've taken all the resources of that meteor, then you move your flag to the next one, and so on and so forth.
Like it's almost comical because obviously, with my backyard I can put up like a little fence around it, but with space, like, oh, like, no, that's my angle, that's my orbit, like don't touch it. So yeah, it's too it I know that there's probably a way to do it. It just doesn't make any sense to me.
I would say my hope for territorial disputes going forward is I hope the governments sign an agreement of non-ownership like we do in Antarctica and say, honor what we say and mean by spaces for everyone when it comes to potential habitable places for humans in the future. So any long-term colonization efforts, governments should refrain from saying, we own this. My hot take for space property rights, though, is if you're the first one to the rock and you're able to capture it and bring it back to your facility, it's yours. And you can't just radar mark something and claim it. And you might think that may suppress the development of radar technology for like deep space probing. However, you won't know the rock is there to claim unless you scan for it in the first place. So you'll still need good radar systems. But if we just open up, again, Marcel points out like it's a really good thing. Like, how do we tell when some corporation just, fricks part of the asteroid belt and goes, there's a lot of great stuff over here. It's mine now. Like, no, that obviously can't work. It just needs to be, if you're able to get out there and make use of the resource, then you get to, it's yours, like salvage rights, because it is just out there floating around, not doing anything. We're not disturbing anything by pulling all of these off. Like we could empty the asteroid belt and it wouldn't matter. The asteroid belt doesn't do anything. It's a collection of rocks in a gravity well. Jupiter accelerated them and they got stuck there. That's it.
I could see that working for the resource portion, but for colonization, I think when you try, I mean, in effect, I think of, let's say that people transplant themselves. I mean, it's finally, we find a way to make it habitable, whether it be, I don't know, whatever technology it takes to do that. Well, then I feel like the governments are going to have a vested interest in that because they can, you can expand your country, but also like you've got the added complication of if I'm a US citizen there and like, I mean, we would have to assume that murder wouldn't take place, right? Like what happens? And where do governments get involved? I feel like that would kind of nudge them, but then I feel like they'd also have this natural tendency to just flex their power.
Great television show on Amazon called The Expanse. It will answer all of these questions with probably a horrific foresight.
I've never seen it. I actually haven't heard of it. I'll have to look into that then.
I will give it a 10 out of 10. It is sci-fi in the truest sense of where it is science, and the only fiction part about it is that it's taking place relatively in the future, but it's also doesn't put on any of the fancy like there's no fancy way to slow down your ship. You just got to turn around and start an acceleration burn. Like it's actually just space. And has a great conflict between the Earth, Mars, and what comes to be known as the Belt, where people living out in stations like Ceres, Ganymede, Titan, and these other deep space habitable areas or potentially habitable areas. I think the ISS offers us hope that the governments could realize that it's not economically or resourcely or materially viable to have a whole bunch of different colonies on the moon. We're going to want one big colony on the moon, and we're going to want to send resources to that centralized location because that's going to be the best way to prevent a catastrophic failure for your specific team. You don't want your colony to get spaced.
And then the colony gets so big that they declare independence from the rest of the Earth. So that's...
And then they have their Marines train in 1G gravity for some suspicious reason.
Yeah, like without making too many references to the show, I do think that the ISS is, it's going well so far? Question mark. But I think, and again, no, not a total expert, but one of the first reasons why they were like, okay, the ISS is a good idea is because no one nation wanted to upfront the cost of building the whole thing. Once nations get richer and they're able to, Russia said they would go away, right? And China has already done their own thing. Who's to say that, the US won't be like, actually, we want another one. So they'll just build another one and they'll just put it somewhere else.
I feel like the two factors that are going to influence how this unfolds, the biggest one will be, are there resources that are valuable? Because I think that once we introduce an economic portion to this, then nations are more likely to be like, nope, this is mine. Like, and that will also breed the possibility for fighting, especially for territorial claims. Versus the International Space Station, I think one of the reasons it's successful is because it's like smaller and contained. So you've got like representatives. It's not just like the entire population. The other reason is what I was just getting at there, which is the economic portion. We're focused. It's really not profitable which is why the governments are funding it, like Josh mentioned earlier. But also, there's not resources that they're claiming. They are exploring, and there is knowledge. So it's not like a tangible thing that they're like having to stake a claim in, even though they did stake a claim in the moon.
They can also stake out a metaphorical claim, I guess, on the knowledge that they find, right? Because if they're doing the research and the scientists who are there are from a specific nation, they could always choose not to share it, to keep it to themselves.
Yeah, intellectual property value almost.
Yeah, they're like, well, we found this really cool secret. It doesn't even have to be, like just science, right?
Yeah, and I think Marcelo's highlights something because, like, if you think about it, especially like Ryan, as you mentioned, once there becomes more of an economic factor, if a particular nation develops a lot better engine, and most of the economy, say in 100 years, 150 years, is going to be more focused around getting these minerals and resources out of space, then that engine technology is going to be one of the most profitable things on the planet. I guess at that point in the solar system, because if you're able to complete your mission 10-15% faster, could be days off, could be weeks off a mission, depending on where you're going. And time is money. So I think there is that unfortunate part. Like when I was writing up the show notes, and like one of my cons of like government run programs is that they eventually will put guns in space. We already have uniquely developed anti-satellite missiles. Because reasons, they're actually very bad to fire off. But Russia, the United States, and China all had to make sure they tested theirs.
Well, if one's got a mutually assured destruction becomes the only deterrent at that point.
You can't build a new missile without testing it for the other countries to see. Like, what are we doing?
Gotta flex it.
But I think that's what will also be interesting to see about the future of space colonization, also on the line of profitability, is the first long-term colony on the moon is going to be a research station with astronauts on it who rotate much like they do for the International Space Station. And that will probably be the first decade, 2 decades, depending on where the technology is and how quickly it advances. And for that reason alone, a lot of the initial infrastructure and what gets done in terms of building habitable spaces on the moon won't have much involvement from private corporations, other than maybe what we see now with how SpaceX and these other companies interact with the government. Because SpaceX picks up contracts to bring materials to the International Space Station here and now and again. So I could see like corporations doing that as space becomes more and more relevant, as we're able to capitalize on more and more of its resources. There's also something that the government will want to have its stake, not necessarily in space, but in an outpost on the moon, Mars, Ceres, Ganymede, whatever, because that will enable their citizens access to the ports to take advantage of those outposts. So the initial setup is going to be non-profitable, pretty much government run, and governments will also have a pretty strong, incentive. So I think there's at least some hope for maybe not like a land war per se in space, but I think it's a pretty good assumption that someone's going to get a little too handsy about a certain asteroid, and it's not going to end well for people. That is just going to happen eventually. Because even maybe some arguments about having a proper claim system of just scanning figuring out what's valuable and just assigning regions to certain people or certain nations to avoid the problem of two ships bumping, out to each other, trying to claim the same rock out in space. Not that that is likely, because rule number one about space is big. That is rule number one. You could probably be out there for your entire life and never encounter another ship in the asteroid belt if you truly felt like it. Space, it is phenomenally large.
So long as they don't go to the same spot. Well, so the greatest push was obviously when NASA, which we would go with here as the public portion, right, government funded, led that. And now we've seen that it's, well, if there is no return, the government will fund it, but also the government's not really putting a lot of money into it. In fact, it seems like all nations are putting more money into things that can double for like military, for the U.S. Department of Defense aspects, right? So like they're going to fund research that does a lot of overlap. It might have space application, but like whether it be like lasers or like some kind of like radar type of improvement, it does have a military application. Do you guys think that the next big expansions are more likely to come from the public or the private portions here? Like, are we thinking like SpaceX, or are we thinking more like NASA? Because like I think NASA has a distinct disadvantage in that it's funded by the government, right? So, as you know, unless if the government doesn't want, I mean, they cut back their budget a lot, but also from the private sector, they're not likely to put money into it unless they think they're going to get a return on their investment.
We've already seen some pretty cool things that SpaceX has produced. Their ability to send up a rocket, deliver a payload, and have that rocket come back intact. Amazing.
Yeah.
Like we used to do payload delivery by shuttles, of where it would fire off those rockets, then the two side ones would fall out, and there was the main thruster, then that would fall, and then it would take it up and people come back down. Like a lot more big metallic waste and manufacture things just falling down to the planet and burning up an atmosphere. So the rockets from SpaceX, in terms of delivering cargo, are a lot more efficient, not because they have new engine technology, but every pound of rocket you don't have to discard and don't have to waste is several pounds of fuel you don't have to burn. And of course, we've seen here recently the completion of a few of SpaceX's manned missions as well, which, up to the International Space Station, they delivered a crew. So I think in newer flight devices, the private sector is doing a lot better. And if you look at NASA's description and what they're focusing on, I think that's reflective. Because a lot of what they talk about with Project Artemis, which is the overarching plan at NASA right now, which is to return to the moon soon. They were hoping by 2024. That's not going to happen. I'm sorry, NASA. Like a couple other websites.
You already got to approve the 2023-2024 budget. If they don't have it, it's not going to happen.
But they were focusing a lot more on colonization efforts, on structures, on vehicles, spacesuits. Because when the SpaceX people went up, they actually went up in a SpaceX rocket, but in NASA's latest revision of spacesuits. And that's because, earnestly, with our still very naive position in space exploration, there's not a lot of, at times, ego between a lot of these people. Like, oh, you have this better thing? Excellent. We're going out into the vacuum. This is an incredibly bad idea from the get-go. So I think it's mixed, but I think there's going to be more money coming in from the private sector, if even in smaller, more focused areas.
If they can reduce the risk, then sure. I agree. I also don't have any faith from the federal government, because they seem to be cutting everything that I love. So, and I love NASA, so they're like, what is NASA anyways? And then, sure, whatever. I honestly, at this point, I expect Raytheon to get to the moon faster than NASA again, right? Like, no love lost for large government contracts for other companies.
And the government contracts, I think, is another important thing that we should probably touch on, because and you mentioned this a second ago, Josh, you're seeing even the developments and like the involvement from private sector pieces like SpaceX. They're contracted by the government. So the government's not putting the funding into NASA, they're putting it into private. So that tendency is I feel like my money would be on the private sector, just because even with the public involvement of the government, they tend to be, from what I'm seeing anyway, putting it into the private sector. What do we think are the pros and cons of public versus private? We can start with the pros of the public sector. I mean, I think getting us to the moon is a massive pro, but like currently modern day, I feel like there's been a very large gap. Like NASA hasn't, I'm not saying that NASA is irrelevant, but I don't think that it's been in the public eye in the same way that it was at all. So what might be some pros that have been overlooked in the last, I don't know, what, 20, 25 years?
I don't think the national pride should be this kind of as a massive pro, because
Sure.
confidence in government is at an all-time low.
Yeah.
I think that I love the NASA T-shirts with like the NASA like the little caps, and like it's just like I'm a huge fanboy, and I think when you read stories of people who were like watching TV and like they were listening to the radio, well, like the first man on the moon and everything and all that, and I think going back it would be a huge pro of like doing it. I think it's a lot worse, and I'm being hyperbolic again, but I think it's a lot worse to be like we're landing on the moon again. This broadcast is brought to you by McDonald's. Like this broadcast is brought to you by like HelloFresh. Use the code MOON to get 50% off on your next. It's a lot. It feels so much worse than to say like, yeah, like I'm not the biggest fan of respect our troops or whatever, but I'll salute the astronauts for sure. Like I would do it a lot more if they didn't have like logos stamped on their backs.
Enemy goes more like NASCAR. This astronaut is sponsored by
one step, one small step, whatever. But first, here's Squarespace. Have you heard of Squarespace?
If there is a touchdown successfully and a return, free fries at McDonald's on Monday after the game.
I would do it. And go ahead, Josh. But I would.
No, I was going to make a
believe
very
that.
silly joke.
That's what they do back home. I don't know. I haven't seen it here that much. But like when Peru goes to the World Cup, not that often, right? But when we do, it's like if we win this match, then a bunch of people are out to celebrate, and then there's a national holiday, and people are like out there on the streets, and then they give a free. I don't know. I'm off to a tangent, but I think having like when India launched their first satellite like a couple of years ago, like people from India were like, "Oh my God, this is insane! This is so cool!" And like, because it's something that you can, there's a lot of things you can be proud of for your country, but I think space exploration is one of them.
Yeah, I mean, the pure difficulty of space exploration and the dangers and challenges it poses to the crew who undertake such missions it's hard to look at and not go, "Oh, that's really badass." But just the audacity to step into a spaceship and let it blast you to the moon, and to think, all right, something is probably going to go wrong. Everything there's been slight, malfunctions in almost every mission, and we're just going to fix it. It could be like Apollo 13 levels of bad, and we're just going to fix it.
Yeah.
That's incredible. And if you read some of the profiles of the people who become astronauts, you will feel insignificant and lazy.
There's
some of the best.
incredible, strenuous, like, I mean, both physically, mentally, it's just, I mean, it's basically Space Navy SEALs. I mean, not quite to the Navy SEAL level, but it's rigorous.
But there's been like a guy who was like, I forget whether he was what special forces in. He was like United States Special Forces, got his JD, got his MD. He was Air Force. He was a pilot.
Yeah.
And then became an astronaut, and then had like a master's in like astrophysics as well. And I was like, well, okay, this guy's like completed 5 different career runs and then flew up into space. All right.
Just rounded out for the infinity gauntlet of careers.
And I think even in that sense, giving not just national pride, but giving a nation heroes, people who you can look to and go, here are people willing to not sacrifice their lives in the way of like an armed forces or an army would, but to expose themselves to danger out of curiosity. And And if there's anything to be said about humans, is that we're very curious and we want to go places. We were not content until we had mapped out every aspect of this earth. Like we were like, okay, we're going to find everything. We started in Africa. We realized we could live pretty much anywhere, and we immediately did. It took humans like 30,000 years to go everywhere across the globe. We were barely putting together these very rickety boats, and we're like, this is good enough to sail over to the Americas with, and they did.
And yet we refuse
the audacity of humans
to because I honestly, I think it's because we're terrified to do so. But we're not exploring the oceans. We're going to space. And I was like, there's a lot of really creepy, really terrifying stuff at the bottom of the oceans. I don't blame them for not going there, but I just think it's funny that they've and it's not that we don't have stuff going down there, but I feel like we've put more money into funding things to go to space than to explore and map the depths of the ocean.
It's just a lot cooler to send out rockets. Like, oh wow, cool rocket.
I just the way that I am, like, I'm not necessarily claustrophobic, but just the thought of having to go down into the ocean, where if something goes wrong, I would face one of my greatest fears, which would be drowning to death. Like, I personally couldn't do it.
Ryan,
Dying,
I have some
also
comforting
one of my
news.
greatest fears. I agree.
I have some comforting news, Ryan. You won't drown. You'll be crushed by the pressure.
I mean, you're right. But still, I mean, one way or the other, we're getting technical here, whether I drown or I'm crushed by the ocean, I didn't want to die in the depths of the ocean. And the same for space, then you just have a vacuum with no air.
The view in space, though, the view on your way out.
That's true. It'd
be hard to beat.
Much better view going out in space than you would in the ocean. So I feel like those were mostly limited to the pros of the public. What would be the pros then of the private sector then? Because I feel like we've got, when we introduced the private sector, I feel like that was when we started shifting a little bit more to the concepts of almost like the joyrides, right? Like NASA started looking at, like, let's keep exploring for science, let's send the rovers, etc. But I feel like SpaceX and like anything else that's been private has been focused more, and I could be wrong on this, but my perception has been that they focused more on, let's get the technology so that we can get people. At this point, it's too freaking expensive, so it's gonna be like the richest of the rich, but like getting people, not just necessarily trained astronauts, to be able to go out into space.
It's definitely, like, honestly, and the only reason why they started doing it is because the government is so, like, useless at, getting, like, and again, I'm sorry, NASA, I love you forever, but it's only because the government efforts have been not so fruitful in the last however many years. The private companies are like, okay, maybe there's a space for us here to carve out for themselves. And I think one of the biggest pros, sadly, is that they're doing it for profit. So they're not gonna, like, if they're doing it, it's because they can make a profit out of it, right? And then and they evaluated the risk, and like you said, they're probably gonna do it so that they can put up hotels over there and then just sell it to the mega rich, and then eventually they'll put smaller hotels, and it'll be for the ultra rich, and then this will keep going down the line until it's affordable enough for us in like maybe 200 million years, let's say. But I think, I don't know. I guess the biggest pro is that at least they're doing something, right? In the free marketplace of ideas, and I guess our ideas are not that bad. I do have a problem with, and like, we're talking about pros, right? So I don't want to break this up again, but
yeah, hold that. We'll get to that.
They are using government money. Fine, I'll wait for the cons.
I don't know. I don't even. That might be a con, but I mean, it could also be a pro, right? Because if the government has the money, but they don't have the ability to use it well, and me, I tend to think that the government is not exactly the best at allocating tax dollars. If they've allocated it to a group that uses it more effectively, I would say that that's a better use, even though it's gone private at that point. I mean, that could still be a pro, and then you've almost got a teamwork going between the government, knowing, where should we pass this off to the private sector, the free market of ideas. So that could be a pro or a con, depending on how much you flesh it out and where you go. Josh, what did you think on the pros of the private portion?
One of the pros relates back to the first rule of space, that being space is big. Douglas Adams, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Rule number 1, space is big. And that means it takes a lot of money to even get a very minuscule grasp of everything going on out there. We will not be able to deplete the asteroid belt of rare resources before either leaving the solar system or something terrible happens to us as a species. It's too big. There's too much. There is unlimited resources out there of different metals, different who knows what things we're not quite sure how to use, things we may or may not have encountered in significant amounts to make usable here on Earth. Maybe there's, a giant asteroid of it floating around out there, and we can use this not new metal, but very uncommon enough we haven't found a good economic use for it now because of its abundance out in the asteroid belt. We can make it then. So from that aspect, kind of like Marcel, at least they're doing something. But I think in terms of as we look to advance our technologies and have an increased reliance on these metals, the better access to them that space mining will provide will make a lot more technology more broadly accessible and for a lot lower price and a lot less on-planet impacts of disruptive mining. Like if you look up images from different rare earth mineral mines, that are in China, that are in South America, that are in parts of Africa, they're incredibly destructive programs. And a lot of them cause resource wars and conflicts in those countries that are happening. Like how many people have died in the Congo over resources to make our cell phones? It's a shocking number of people. These are less likely to happen in space. And that's at least something that focusing on less destructive ways of acquiring economic resources is always going to be good. And that's not something the government is too fond of doing when it comes to its space work, for good reasons. It's the government's willingness to take on non-profit generating scientific programs is an excellent role for a non-profit generating entity. But in terms of making strategic and quick use of new resources out and throughout space, you just let the capitalists do their thing. Like maybe they'll find a way to destroy the world with it. I don't know. But I doubt it. Space is big. So I think the increase of specialized groups, because the companies will find their niche of things they do. There'll be dedicated tourism companies. There'll be dedicated mining companies. There'll be dedicated, low and medium Earth orbit companies for satellites. And this has the possibility to advance those particular technologies better than a generalized space exploration program. The focus of these teams is a bit of in of itself, in my opinion, that the government agency just trying to do lots of science doesn't quite have.
Yeah. They've also only got so many resources, right? So like if the government is limited in the number of people who can do things, expanding your team through the private sector, that becomes a benefit. Yeah. Like if the government has, let's say they have all this money, but they don't have the people who either have the know-how or the drive or like whatever they're lacking. If they have the funds and they can delegate it, then we see the pros coming out through that delegation in the private sector.
Or if a private company can do it for cheaper, as Marcel has been talking about, this reliance on government money of companies like SpaceX. SpaceX gets a ton of money from NASA, a ton of contracts.
Yeah.
But NASA's being smart. It would cost NASA more money to do it themselves. So they can get more science done by contracting SpaceX. And that's a good decision. And that is where the specialization and division of the teams can shine sometimes of. The really specialized rocket delivery people, turns out, made a really good rocket delivery program. Do they know how to run a space station? Probably not. Do they know how to organize a flight to the moon? Probably not. But they can make a rocket that delivers supplies really well. There's benefits to that.
And I mean that almost, I mean, in my sector, in the academic sector, the management concept there is delegation, right? So if the government knows their limits, then they're making good use of it. And as we're not wrapping this up quite yet, but I want to make sure Marcelo gets this chance to talk about the cons. Go ahead, Marcelo. we'll shift those gears there. Go ahead and go off on those cons.
Already, the concept what? The public or the concept of private?
Why don't you pick? I'm good with either.
Yeah, I mean, well, we can go with the concept public, right?
Okay, concept public it is.
I think, well, the concept of living there into the public, I think, just invert what we talked about with the private corporations. Is that if you just leave it up to the U.S., leave it up to China, leave it up to Russia, like the big, also no love lost for big imperialistic countries to go out and do their imperialism somewhere else, right? Even if there's nobody living out there, it's still not a huge fan, not the biggest fan of that. So I'm between a rock and a hard place, right? You either have all of these corporations doing it, or you have you have a bunch of little like US flags being planted on every asteroid that they can find, right? So it's not. I also think it's like Josh said. I think it goes slower, for sure. I have no expectation of NASA doing everything they promised they will do. I also have no expectation of their funding growing any bigger, knowing how things are going here. And to their credit, I will say that we could use that money here in this world, like on the Earth, a little better. We have, I think, a few issues we need to fix up before we take care of everything else.
Well, you've almost got a Maslow's hierarchy of needs at play, right? Because when people are struggling with an economy where they're not able to afford things that they might have been able to before that they need now, then they might be like, yeah, I don't know that I really want all this money spent on space exploration doesn't affect me personally.
Yeah, like a lot of messaging, it kind of goes that way. It's like, do you like space exploration? Do you like NASA? And people are like, yeah, well, I love wow, going to the moon is great. And it's like, well, did you know that NASA gets this much? And then rent is an all-time high, and like you can't even afford food and all of these things, and and here's your $600 check for the pandemic. Then people are like, what the heck, what's going on? Why am I not getting that money? So it makes sense, right? Like I'll never advocate for funding that over many other things that we need here.
Cons of public to you, Josh. What do you think?
I think there should be a lot of concern about the naturally occurring resources in space and a government monopolizing on them through whether it be agency controlling what rocks people are and aren't allowed to gain access to. Because I believe there will come a time where we will need so much of these minerals. If we're not mining them in space, we will just not have enough of them on Earth. As we start to learn better and better how to use these more advanced compounds to further drive our technology to limits beyond, eventually it's going to become too detrimental to get it from Earth, and we'll be faced with okay, are we going to do something different and find a completely and entirely new technology, or do we go get rocks from space? And so having the government being able to monopolize on that doesn't sound great. Like you wouldn't necessarily want there to be like a hunting license of where you're like given so many asteroid tags you're allowed to use per asteroid season. Like, no, like space is big. Space is unfathomably big. There's plenty of rocks for everyone. Every human could go and pull like another entire planet of another 7, like every human could have 7 billion rocks in space, and there'd probably be quintillions of rocks left. It's so absurd. So I think when it comes to that, especially when we start getting into deep space, when we're actually talking about the asteroid belt and things just so far removed from planetary concerns, like unless someone intentionally like does the math to send one of them to Earth, which would just be a terrorist act anyways, its own set of problems, it'd be impossible to hurt the planet by something you do in space. Like you're just millions of kilometers away. It's not a problem what you do out there. So I think some hesitancy about once we get out there and once we get away from colony bases might be detrimental. In that sense, I also think, as Marcel pointed out, people can get a little wishy-washy on space spending, even as I will contend. It's not that much. Like NASA's budget's like either 19.6 billion or like 21 billion. It fluctuates between those two numbers roughly. As horrific as thing this is about to say, that's not a lot of money to the American government.
Not in the grand scheme of things.
There's a lot of state governments that operate with those levels of and wouldn't consider that a ton of money anyways. Like if you came in like a 20 billion program to California and New York, they'd be like, okay, that's a program. But at the same time,
well, you're assuming that the government's going to reject money with that. They were like, I'll take as much money as you could possibly give me. I feel like both of the things that you guys mentioned can also be applied to the private sector. It seems like, at least for now, the freelance portion that is like SpaceX, etc., that they've managed it well, right? Like they've taken that and they've done innovation and they've expanded it well. Do you think that we have any danger then of them like not like going rogue, but like misusing the funds that they're given as stewardship? Or like what might be the cons specific to the private sector? Because like I could see the things you mentioned also being a danger to the private because it is money that's sometimes just being almost like sublet to them. But go ahead, Marcelo.
I'm gonna beg the question. I'm gonna say, I'm gonna jinx it. Okay, I'll say, what's the worst that could happen, right?
Oh man, don't say that.
What's the worst that could happen? Do we get SpaceX drones? Like flying around and like mining all those minerals and then coming back here and destroying the U.S. Army? I think we're far away from that. I don't think, and I'll give it to the capitalists, right? Like they love their shareholders, right? And if their shareholders are happy and they're making a profit, then that means that they're advancing their mission, their purpose, which is to extract as much value from space as possible. And again, to Josh's credit, that makes a lot of sense. I would much rather them go out in space and mine those minerals than stay here mining the same minerals. So if they can go out there, they do their own thing. I think it's fine. I think them going rogue is a possibility. We're not. I don't think we're there yet. I don't expect any sort of planetary invasion anytime soon.
There's the level of concern for the involvement of private corporation comes in about keeping a central focus on what we're sending up, when we're sending up, and where it's flying. And the governments have to do a really good job about this. Like if a satellite breaks up in orbit, they will track its debris the best they can, even down to like a couple inches, piece of steel, like a couple inches across. And why? Because that piece of steel, a couple inches across, is probably moving at a couple tens of thousands of kilometers an hour and could take out another satellite. If it was a foot across or so, it could take out a spaceship or a shuttle. And there has been some concern, especially with people like Elon Musk and a little bit of his less than optimal satellite management by SpaceX that we've seen, where the Starlink has been questionable with its satellite safety, because there is a concern, in particular with low Earth orbit satellites, that we're not doing the best of job managing them, even in the status quo. And that is when one of them breaks. It breaks into a whole bunch of small space debris that can destroy a whole bunch of other satellites. And if they impact other satellites, they create more debris, which will create more satellites. Thinking about it, was just a worse than exponential growth, because one piece of fragment could make thousands of other fragments. So this has been colloquially named the Kessler Syndrome, and it's been one of the hallmark warnings. Some people think we're already on an unstable.
What was it called?
The Kessler Syndrome.
Kessler Syndrome.
And it wasn't given that name by the person who came up with it, who was Dr. Kessler. He is a NASA engineer who focused specifically on space debris. And this isn't a total calamity. It could be. No one's quite sure. There's some speculation out there, but at least be a minor calamity, which is if we had full cascade failure, it would destroy pretty much all of our low Earth orbit satellites, which would be your GPS, your satellite, communication, your cell phones. A lot of infrastructure would quit working. And we wouldn't be able to place anything else up back in low orbit for probably 200 or 300 years. We'd be able to get things up in space. We'd be able to launch like mid-Earth or high Earth orbit satellites. So internet connections would have a higher latency. You ever tap the link on your phone and it takes a second to load. It's not just the internet speed. The signal has to go from your phone up to a cell tower and then away. All right. So when that happens in space, and remember rule number one, space is big. Speed of light delay actually matters. Yeah. The clocks are set differently on GPS satellites than they are down here on Earth. In one part, that's accounting for relativity. Another part, that's dealing with the fact that space is big, and it's literally just later in time when those signals get up to the satellite. So the satellite has to adjust and predict in a way. And those problems would get worse if we had to move to mid-Earth or high Earth orbit. And some technologies just won't work in mid-Earth orbit. That could be bad. So keeping track of every launch, methodically planning, where it's going to go and when it's going to go is crucial. Since like the mid-90s, the ISS has had to dodge 29 times.
Mm.
And I do mean they activated thrusters and dodged with the space station a piece of debris. And that piece of debris was not natural.
Yeah.
It was a piece of a satellite,
Man.
all 29 times. So for things like space stations, unless shields are magically possible, even a tiny little thing the size of a quarter, the size of someone's hand, can destroy an entire station, could possibly kill hundreds if we're not tracking every single piece of debris and keeping our satellites safe to not have that compound and be a problem. Some people speculate if it did get dense enough, you wouldn't be able to launch or return from the Earth, as you would just be peppered by debris and it would destroy any shuttle that came and went. And that's a possibility, but not too likely.
Which what you just talked about, Josh, does kind of raise the issue of collaboration on an international level, right? Because if we're not coordinating, almost like flight patterns when it comes to airports, right? Like you have to know where the planes are so that they don't run into each other. We need some kind of global, concentrated, unified efforts that we know at least kind of what's going on, where people are at. But let's just briefly talk about policy. Like what do we think this would take, like for the colonization portion? Like what, just on a practical level, what does space TSA look like? Like what are we going to be what do we deal with this as policy to kind of get that, either that unity that we need, or like the practical steps to like get to the next portion of space exploration? And like this is all hypothetical, like I'm just looking for a fun theoretical idea here.
You would need intense management.
It would be so hard. It would be so hard because once it's economical enough to just build your own launch pad, right? It's just go up, and then I guess people can tell you to not go up, but unless you have like complete control over the airspace, once you're up there, who's going to stop you, right?
That's where space military comes in. Point two.
Space Force. Space Force.
Yeah. And it has to be the US. They have to decide who's coming in and out, right? And then just we start there.
The life support systems would give a critical new meaning to the word vacancy or no vacancy. Because that could actually be like, something that has to be thought about. Like if there was a resort colony on the moon, the fire marshal's people limit, very serious thing, because there might not be enough air to breathe.
But wait, can we have a fire in space where there's no oxygen? Genuine question here.
Certain types
instead of a fire extinguisher, you just open the hatch and then the space comes in and just sucks out all the fire. We don't need fire marshals in space, Josh.
So
probably a super fire. I don't know what actually would happen in space.
So there's a lot of compounding issues. A lot of the list of what you cannot bring on the space shuttle would be immense.
No poor people. That's rule number one. It costs too much right now.
I have a semi-optimistic thought. I don't think it will take that terribly long for commercial space flights to get too horrendously unexpensive.
None if we can get it. Maybe for like the cost of a Disney vacation for a family, one person can go within the next little bit. Because like if we let the capitalism drive it, I could see you being right there, Josh.
Yeah, I mean, even if you can only get someone up there for a couple hours, maybe not even a day. There's a ton of people in the world who will pay you $1,000, $2,000 for that.
I'm thinking of pay-per-view.
I would pay.
I would be one of them.
$10,000 for 5 minutes.
I was thinking of like the pay-per-view, the add-on stuff in gaming, but it's like for this much more per hour, you get oxygen. Like they just they start adding. We have this package and that package.
Yeah, you thought the turbulence and economy was rough. It's the economy space JetBlue space shuttle. Yeah. There's, in my opinion, that's why Ryan kind of talked about a need for a highly centralized strategic planning of resources, of people. Likely if there were a resort ship and say there's like a space hotel, every ship would come up there with the life support supplies for the new passengers they were bringing aboard. They'd probably get a set of passengers to come down. because you would have to, you know, being mindful of oxygen and water resources is really hard, and being mindful of the you know, the economics of getting those things up and off the planet. Like when we're looking at developing the moon, one of the first things we want to do is develop a rocket platform there, because it's a lot easier to take off from the moon than it is to take off from Earth.
That
So if
makes
you can
sense.
use more efficient,
There's
lower
no
power
gravity
rockets,
holding you down.
yeah, like you can actually do a really long distance space mission. We don't have to burn 75% of your fuel getting off the planet.
Just get out.
Yeah, you just leave. So I don't know. I'm hopeful, like in the next 30 to 40 years, we see a lot of innovations with space technology, access to space, space tourism. You know, when will there be a publicly visible location on the moon? You know,
Listen, you let Disney have the option to do it, it'll get done. It'll be expensive, but it'll be done. The Disney Plus Plus package gets you access to space. You can be with among the first handful of people to experience space.
yeah, I mean, and the mysticism of going, and I think will always draw people towards wanting to go, towards wanting to be involved, even if it makes them, for some reason, not inclined to want to fund it too well in the here and now. But you know, we quite literally are looking out into the infinite expanse with untold possibilities. That is truly our playground. So settle up and let's blast off.
Marcelo, last thoughts before we go to hot takes?
No thoughts.
No
Empty
thoughts.
only. No thoughts, only space. Empty head.
All right. Well, we'll be right back with our hot takes then. Remember, you're listening to the Central Hub for Political Discourse. All right. In this brief break, Marcelo, why don't you tell them about our membership options, and then I've got a special announcement for us coming up before we go back.
Absolutely. So remember that you can always support us for more behind the scenes footage, and you can join the Discord. Please support us, and thank you so much to our supporters for coming with us so far.
Get to view us as people. You can hear all about our days, our weeks, our jobs.
Yeah, we don't argue 24/7.
We don't. We
Usually.
actually we have a good time behind the scenes. The announcement that I have, so Ken Drew from Taboo Topic is starting a new series called Blueprint, and I'm going to be a recurring guest on that series. Basically, instead of just complaining about the government, we're going to talk about like what might be some policy proposals, and we'll unpack some ideas. So that might include some things more along the lines of like what the Federalist Papers laid out. Now, this wasn't something that was laid out in those, but the first topic that I'll be recording with him tomorrow on Friday actually is going to deal with congressional term limits. And so we're kind of doing like a thought experiment with each one of these Blueprint segments. I don't know how many segments he's got lined up. It'll probably go just until we run out of content, but that will be something that will also be hosted on our channel as well as his. If you want it early, check out Taboo Topic, which I can link in the description below, or you can just stay tuned and we'll keep blasting out announcements there. All right, let's go to hot takes. All right, Marcelo, we got you with the first hot takes.
It's going to be the shortest and smallest hot take of all. I love space. I really cannot, even in my worst dreams where we go to work in an asteroid and we all, have it's a bunch of, our names are actually a bunch of numbers followed by the brand that we sponsor. It's 00455, Squarespace, Manscaped, right? I still love the idea. I cannot wait for it to become more, just more advanced. And while I will probably not live to see the day where we go out there in the stars, for fun, I'm still very much looking forward to it. And that's one of the reasons why I would like to just, stay here for a little while longer. I'm very excited. I said it at the beginning of the show, and I'll say it again. Love the quote of, we do these things not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Either if it's going to be the U.S., it's going to be anyone else. Whoever gets up there, good luck. That's it.
Interestingly, that's also the grad school motto. We do these things because they're hard. All right. I agree with what Marcelo said. I think space is fascinating. One thing that I wouldn't say this is a drawback. I just think that the timing with how economically strained we are, I sympathize and also empathize with the people who are like, well, why is that money going towards space? as an academic, I understand the educational value. And I mean, just, I think both Josh and Marcella mentioned this earlier, just the human tendency and desire to explore is there. And I think that that's why that's going to remain a positive thing. But timing wise, it can be a little bit rough. For a policy proposal as a hot take, I would say I think Congress should only be able to spend the money that they can mine out of space. Make Nancy Pelosi, make Chuck Schumer, make all of Mitch McConnell, make them go out to space and work for their money before they get to spend it. But all right, that's about it. I think that it'll be interesting to watch how space unfolds, because I think there are even unforeseen complications. Like we joked about, what types of regulations would you need, how much government involvement. And right now, I don't know exactly why it's been as harmonious as it has been, but that's been a positive. Hopefully that doesn't change. Less of a hot take and more of just a hope there.
My hot take is I want NASA to have $150 billion per year as their baseline budget.
What do they have now?
Like 20-ish, 26, okay. 19. It's not a lot. Like, not a ton in terms of actual government spending, but to really take a serious look at refocusing on to give our nation something to believe in. Like, we all look around at the world, it's not great. It doesn't feel like it's getting much better. To give people something to hope in, to dream for. And I think that is the alluring promise of space exploration, because it functions as this continual reminder of what we are doing is more than ourselves. Whether it be someone's private, religion or moral philosophy, whatever decides about the world, there's still this fundamental conclusion that we kind of do care about the coming and future generations. And there's not a better way of showing our commitment to those ideals than space exploration, knowing that funding now, as Marcel pointed out, may not reflect fund space tourism in our lifetime. Might for our grandchildren, though. And that'll be fantastic, because there is this itch, this urge to go and look, to see, find our place, to understand more. And space offers us that, and it offers us unity, and it offers us growth, and it is the location and place of so many fantastical dreams and fiction for a reason. And getting people out there, reminding them that something so large and magnificent is possible and and is within the capabilities of our species to do something, I think is also a humbling experience. I remember there's this great quote, I forget which astronaut unfortunately said it off the top of my head. He said he wanted to bring up every single member of Congress up into above orbit where they could see the whole planet, and have them turn and face at them and look at them and go, "Look at it, you bastards. Look at it." And let them pause there on that moment, seeing the totality of all humans that ever will and ever have been, and a tiny blue pale dot floating like a mote of dust across the vast cosmos, and the true final frontier.
All right. Well, remember, you can find us on Spotify, Apple, YouTube, Twitch, and Google Podcasts. Follow us on our social medias at Between the Liars to stay updated, so you know when we go live and when we do special crossovers and have guests on. And if you enjoy this show and you want to give us a 5-star review and tell people why you love us and how much you love us, aside from the fact that we're awesome, we would greatly appreciate it. All right. I'm sure you find yourself somewhere between the liars. Goodbye for now.